The Work Wellness Institute is transforming research into workplace performance and health. As an organization, we function throughout the complete cycle of turning research into practice, mobilizing knowledge as a research institute, community partner, funder, and educational provider. Our mission of creating safe, healthy, and inclusive workplaces for all is our driving motivation. Learning is a lifelong journey to adapt to the forever-changing needs of the workplace. Whether you are a leader, a professional, an academic, or a student, we provide high-quality resources that are evidence-based, topical, and relevant to all industries. Choose the Work Wellness Institute as your learning journey partner and become a member to gain full access to our diverse knowledge mobilization programming, including lectures on demand, e-curriculum, 3 distinct certification opportunities, and more. Continue to learn and connect with the Work Wellness Institute and see how we can support transforming research into performance and health for your workplace.
Good morning or afternoon or perhaps evening, depending on where you're joining from. Thank you so much for taking the time to spend this hour with us and for joining us in today's webinar on improving online outreach to job seekers with disabilities. My name is Elizabeth White, and I am the team lead of learning and development with the Work Wellness Institute. And I'm here today to help in hosting and moderating today's webinar session. I would like to start things off by acknowledging that I have the privilege to live and work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. This webinar is made possible through the support of our funders, partners, as well as membership to the Work Wellness Institute, and we thank our advisory committees and speakers who contribute to this webinar series. So we are so excited to have Dr. Suzanne Briere with us today. Suzanne holds a PhD CRC and is a professor of disability studies and academic director of the K. Lisa Yang and Hock E. Tan Institute on Employment and Disability, Cornell University ILR School, Ithaca, New York. This institute is a research, training, and technical assistance center focusing on disability inclusion in employment, education, and community. Suzanne serves as Institute Administrative Strategic Lead and as the PI and co-PI of research dissemination and technical assistance efforts focused on employment disability policy and effective disability workplace practices. She is also the PI and project director of the National Policy, Research, and Technical Assistance Center on Employment of People with Disabilities, and that's funded by the USDOL Office of Disability Employment Policy. She is the author and co-author of 5 books, as well as over 180 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters on workplace disability inclusion. And Suzanne also holds a doctoral degree in rehabilitation counseling psychology from University of Wisconsin-Madison and is a fellow in the American Psychological Association. So we're so pleased to have her joining with us today. And thank you so much, Suzanne, for being here with us.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for the introduction, and to the Workplace Wellness Institute for inviting me to share information from our research with the attendees today and your membership. I'm delighted to be here. Our topic today is on improving online outreach to job seekers with disabilities. And in this time that we have together, my intent is to share key findings from recent research in online outreach to job seekers with disabilities that we have conducted through the U.S. Department of Labor grant that Elizabeth mentioned I'm working on. We did a literature review, a website review, focus groups, and then findings from, I'm going to share also findings from a survey of job seekers with disabilities. But mostly because we're assuming many of you here are workplace professionals in one form or another, we're going to talk about the implications for human resource professionals as we close out. Our objectives is in this sharing of information is to increase an understanding of approaches to disability inclusive messaging that we've discovered on Fortune 500 career pages, how job seekers with disabilities approach job searching online, and how to tailor messaging to encourage job seekers with disabilities to apply and to self-identify that they're a person with a disability. As a result of our research, we have many resources online, so we're going to be able to share with you a checklist of practical approaches to improve online outreach in support of increasing disability representation in your workforces. Elizabeth mentioned that I'm working on this Department of Labor grant, and indeed, Cornell is funded as an employer assistance and resource network on disability inclusion, the coordinator of this resource for the Department of Labor, and its purpose is to serve as a resource for employers who are seeking to recruit, hire, retain, and advance qualified individuals with disabilities. This is a cooperative agreement over a 5-year period for $10 million, which I am supposed to disclose. And this presentation doesn't necessarily reflect the views or policies of the U.S. Department of Labor, nor do we try to commercialize any products if we happen to mention things that we have partnerships we've been engaged in. I also want to acknowledge that this has been very much a collective effort across many people on our team, and name Bill Erickson, Matt Sala, Val Malzer, Sarah Von Schroeder, Sarah Van Looy, Sandra Masquera Caminada, and Sabrina Sorenberger, all who contributed to the project I'm going to describe the results of the research about today. So many things prompted this research. The idea came pre-pandemic. We started thinking about this in 2019, and then the pandemic occurred, and certainly we have seen significant changes in the workforce since that time. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that there are more than 13 million job openings right now, and that's in the US. Many of these are due to the millions of workers who have voluntarily resigned from their jobs as a result of their experience during the pandemic. And we know that many DEI, and our A is for accessibility, that we are using, the federal government has this as a part of their affirmative hiring initiative and is labeling it this way. We know that disability online recruitment and outreach is occurring. Certainly online outreach and recruiting is what is being done in many companies anyway today. But for those who want to broaden the workplace, the workforce that they're recruiting from, or the labor force they're recruiting from, we do see an elevation of interest in disability online recruiting. And we're asked if we'd actually look for more information on this to try to enable employers to draw more targeted and successful way from this particular largely untapped labor pool. So the research includes a literature review, a review of corporate career pages, focus groups of young people with disabilities, and a survey of recent job seekers with disabilities. So I'm going to, in the time we have, we want to allow time for questions, quickly go through our findings, and we hope to leave 10 or 15 minutes for the participants today to be able to ask direct questions. So you'll note that I am going through this rather quickly. And I neglected to say I'm coming to you from my office at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. So what is online recruitment? It's a very broad term that includes active processes, which we know are now undertaken quite extensively by employers, such as virtual job fairs, or more passive processes, such as career websites and online application portals. And what our research questions were, what might encourage job seekers with disabilities to apply using these mediums? What might encourage them to self-identify as a person with a disability? And we're interested in that because there is now an initiative, a requirement in the United States for federal recipients of federal contract funding to actually keep track of the proportion of their workforce. And the aspirational goal is 7% of the workforce being people with disabilities across all job categories. So self-identification becomes even more important with that requirement. But we also know people are not necessarily applying in the proportion that is possible, given the prevalence rates of people with disabilities in the United States and other countries. And we wanted to know what are the barriers that they're experiencing so that we could encourage employers to remediate those and become more successful in this affirmative recruitment process. So what we found from our literature review is that recruitment practices, advertising, and reputation all have direct effects on applicant pool quality and quantity. That employee endorsements and testimonials can broaden the applicant talent pools. The literature told us this. Some technologies can unknowingly limit talent pools by filtering out qualified candidates with disabilities. We also got more affirmation about why career pages themselves are actually very important. We, in observing from the literature and later on from direct observation of websites, that website features and approaches to online recruitment play an important part in influencing and attracting qualified people of all kinds, but including people with disabilities, and can facilitate a broadening of employment talent pools of the people who are actually willing to apply. For job seekers, these features also help form a perception of their fit with the organization and therefore encourages them to apply. Career pages are a cost-effective method for efficient employee recruitment, which is why employers are using it in greater amounts all of the time. And so doing it well in a way that will encourage a broad applicant pool, we think is critically important. We found from the literature review these factors or types of messaging that may affect the perception of disability inclusion by job applicants with disabilities. What is perceived, as we learned from the literature, of evidence of disability inclusion were disability and diversity and inclusion statements by employers, disability-focused employee resource groups, this being articulated on the website, visible targeted hiring and recruitment plans were available on the career website. Factors that were discouraging were the reverse, no evidence of disability awareness, or the sites were technically poorly navigable or inaccessible to people with visual impairments or auditory impairments. There were minimal accommodation information, either in the recruitment process to tell people what to do if they needed an accommodation, or evidence that once hired that there was an accommodation process that would support them, and or web-based recruiting filters were limiting diverse candidates by the way the algorithm was framed. So that was our first step in this research. Our next step was to have our research look at pages of corporate 500 websites. We did a random selection of 40. These were companies that were headquartered in 2019 in the United States. And we used our literature review and related experts to design an assessment checklist by which our researchers went through the websites of these 40 randomly selected companies. And now I'm going to kind of quickly go through what we found from this phase 2 of our research, which was this assessment of the websites of 40 Fortune 500 companies. First of all, many more of them were geared toward hiring veterans and or veterans with disabilities, not necessarily veterans with disabilities, but it did include them often. Many more so than had disability-focused hiring priorities, like an applicant fast track, which was only 13%, or a section on their website geared specifically toward hiring people with disabilities was only 20%, or had a specific disability career page of some kind, which is only 15%. Similarly, although we learned from the literature that top leadership commitment to disability being evidenced was very important on online recruitment, we found that only 15% of the websites we reviewed had a statement from senior executives saying that there was a commitment to affirmative recruitment, inclusion, or career development for people with disabilities. And only 1 in 5 showed any kind of business case that the company might have for hiring qualified candidates with disabilities. 2 out of 5 of the companies did, though, if they had a disability inclusion award, and had received such an award, did make that evident on their website. So more did that than did the affirmative recruitment. In terms of disability hiring priorities, half of the companies, 40 companies that our researchers reviewed, had a supplier diversity initiative that included disability or veteran-owned businesses, and they made that evident. So there was an affirmative effort there for partnerships that they had. About only a quarter had people with disabilities in their EEO statements, which is really, I think, very surprising. 1 in 5 had targeted hiring and recruitment programs or initiatives for either disability or neurodiversity or autism at work programs. And only 15% publicized focused internship programs for people with disabilities. And yet we know from other research that when companies have such internship programs, they are 6 times as likely to have more successfully hired people with disabilities in the last year. In terms of evidence of supports or accommodations or work flexibility, which is appealing to many more of us these days post-pandemic, 3 out of 4 said that they had specific information on accommodations either during the recruitment process or once into the organization on their website. So that's a pretty good number. 3 out of 5 had evidence of an employee resource group on their website. Only about a quarter had talked about the company's openness or supportiveness in providing accommodations. Little more than a third had information about flexible work arrangements, and almost half, 48%, talked about work-life balance, again, which is of interest not only to people with disabilities, but to other people as well. In terms of what we call credible media and messaging, and that is they don't just say disability is a part of our DEI statement, but they have either employee testimonials or images of individuals with disabilities who are actually working in the company. Only 30% had testimonials, and 45% of the 40 companies reviewed, whose websites we reviewed, had any images or video of employees with disabilities who are already hired in the organization. And these are seen as credible media about being an affirmative disability employing organization. We also learned from the literature that evidence of disability organization partnerships really can be influential in encouraging people to apply. And that only the minority of organizations had that. 18% had evidence of specific partnerships on their website with organizations that could source qualified candidates with disabilities. And less than a quarter had organizational participation in disability-focused recruitment resources, like a disability job posting board or job fairs. So really affirmative hiring initiatives were evidenced on the website. From that research, from our literature review and from our review of websites, we then moved to another layer of our research and to dig more deeply and hear from the voices of individuals with disabilities. So we conducted focus groups with employers and job seekers and got to get their perspective, both of employer perspective, what they thought they were doing that would perhaps be more targeted in influencing of applicants with disabilities, and then from job seekers as well. So key employer needs related to online research from employers, we recognized in our conversations with them that they need to better understand how to encourage self-identification and the recruitment and application process. Many of our employers that we spoke with, particularly those who are federal contractors and have a requirement of 7% of the workforce being people with disabilities across job categories, wanted to know who were the people with disabilities within their own workforce, but also who are those who are applying, particularly if they were not coming from a targeted referral source. They wanted to also understand the perspective of people with disabilities on their perceptions of the organization from these career pages, and why perhaps they didn't take a job or might have even been discouraged from applying at all. And finally, they wanted to know more about the barriers that candidates experience in the recruitment and application process. So this is what employers told us was important to them. From the key job seeker focus group findings, we learned that certain organizational characteristics and online content can signal an employer's degree of disability inclusion. People were very clear that certain things attracted them or perhaps made them wary of pursuing an application. The positive things that they talked about was a visual representation of disability. So images of people with disability on the website or testimonials of people on the website. Having diversity and inclusion statements that were beyond just the EEO statement, which, as you may recall, we were not the majority of people did not have that in their EEO statement, which is a very simple thing to do. But our job seekers told us even that's not enough. What we want to know is beyond that, that there's evidence that this is very disability friendly kind of organization. So they wanted other kinds of data that said there were accommodations or there were disability organization partnerships or evidence of employees with disabilities who were having a positive experience. Website accessibility was really important. And for those of you that may be new term, it means that people with sensory disabilities or communication disabilities, auditory or visual limitations are able to access material that for people who are blind, that their screen reader technology can read the website, and that it's just user-friendly, that it's it's obvious how to navigate the website and how to create an online profile for an application to submit it. Also, what the job seekers told us, that obvious and easy to access accommodation information was very important to them as well. From these three layers of research, our fourth, and we were leading to this during this process, it was a several-year process, was to actually get a broader perspective beyond the focus groups of job seekers with disabilities and really find out, digging more deeply, what the impact of employer messaging is on websites, particularly the career pages and recruitment pages of websites of companies. So the research questions that we went into this with were these. What online job search strategies do job seekers with disabilities use when job searching? We asked them to actually tell us how they approached this process and how they navigated the websites. How does different online messaging, how are they perceived by job seekers with disabilities? And what practically can employers do online to encourage people with disabilities to, first of all, apply for the job at all, and secondly, to self-identify as a person with a disability? Because again, many employers want to know that these folks are in the candidate pool to be able to, first of all, know if they are doing a good job of affirmatively recruiting from this population. And secondly, if they're losing people somewhere further in the process, like in the selection for interview process, are they getting screened out by their algorithmic screening process? Or is the interview, do they make it to the interview process and then get screened out there? So knowing that the person has a disability is the first stage of being able to do that discernment about where in the process of recruiting and interviewing, selecting, hiring, are we losing candidates who are have historically been marginalized. So the survey components had a demographic component, and I'll share that information, job search strategy component, career pages, web pages, questions, and questions about self-identification as a person with a disability and impact of COVID-19 on the job searching process. So our data collection, again, we were working on this in a couple of years, doing the other things I just spoke about, actually was in December of 2021. And we worked with organizations that we knew had access to individuals with disabilities through their networks, the American Association of People with Disabilities, a disability organization called Disability Solutions, Disability In, which is an employer organization, Workforce Recruitment Program, which is a job candidate database that the Department of Labor manages for the federal workforce. and two other disability-focused organizations, Our Ability and Transcends. The sample analysis, we actually had 827 job seekers with disabilities that we were able to identify through this process of these networks that searched online for work in the past 2 years. Those were the criteria that we wanted. We wanted people who had experience and could speak from that experience, what attracted them or deterred them from these website pages. So this was our solicitation for recruiting individuals. This image that I'm sharing with you here, it says perspectives of job seekers with disabilities, the impact of employer messaging, and solicited people to self-select into this process with us. So we were delighted that we had as many people express an interest and participate as we did. So a little bit about our respondents. A third of them, or actually close to 40%, said that they had an obvious disability, and they talked about it in the application process. 30% said sometimes, the balance said 30% sometimes, and 30% said never, rarely. People who either didn't have to make it obvious because the interview was remote, or they were working remote, or perhaps had a non-obvious disability. But often from we learned from other research, may choose not to self-identify. We had a pretty even split between females, about 53% rounding up compared to 46%. Age group was predominantly younger, about 60% were under 34, a little over a third, 35 to 54, and only less than 5% over 55, so a younger population. 2/3 of our respondents reported being Caucasian or white, 18% Black African, 14% other, and about a third were Hispanic or Spanish origin. Highest educational level was predominantly bachelor's or higher, 46%. About a little less than a third had some college, and the remainder was high school education or technical vocational. In terms of work experience, 95% had been employed, and a little less than half, 49%, were currently employed at the time that they took this survey for us. We asked, because we wanted to understand more how people with disabilities were searching for jobs, and we found that 70% responded often or always looking at job posting websites such as Indeed, Monster, or Craigslist. So indeed, they use those mediums. 45% use social media platforms. 34% used disability-specific job posting websites. 32% attended online job fairs, and about a quarter worked with a recruiter or a headhunter. 2 out of 5 reported that they often or always had a specific employer in mind when searching for a site, which I think all of these things are interesting for us to know as we construct our recruitment websites or career pages websites. Some of the approaches that they used to decide whether or not to pursue an application with a specific employer as they looked at their website. About 2/3 reported often or always going directly to the employer's online career web pages. So they're looking at what does the employer say about career opportunities. That's almost 2/3, 63%. Nearly half used outside websites, not just the employers, like Glassdoor was given as an example, to understand how current employees feel about working for that employer. So people are not only looking at the web pages and making judgments about disability friendliness there, but also sussing out whether or not people have commented on the organization as an employer that has this workplace disability inclusion ethos. 43% searched for the employer on social media platforms like LinkedIn and Facebook, and nearly half, 46%, respondents said that often or always they looked for an employer's disability inclusive messaging when making the decision to apply for a position. elements that increased interest in applying with the employer from what our respondents told us. Flexible work arrangements, not surprising, particularly now post-pandemic, the element most often selected by respondents. Description of work-life balance programs came next at 43% of our respondents. Clear explanation of the accommodations request process for applicants, 2 out of 5, 40% said that. Disability in the D&I statement, 40% included that, and 37% said a description of a disability-focused hiring program. And by that, we mean there was a statement about an affirmative hiring program. Let us know you're either a neurodiverse person or a person with a disability. We have a process to make sure you're included in an accessible program where we can provide accommodations if needed. And that was articulated on the website, and a source of encouragement to people with disabilities to apply, obviously. Other elements that encouraged interest were a diversity and inclusion statement that includes disability and a description of flexible work arrangements. This was even more true for people with very obvious disabilities relative to those with less obvious disabilities. They found that they reported more often that that was a high index for them of desirability. Descriptions of flexibility and work-life balance programming, that was, if you might recall, the number 2 thing that people cited. That was those with least obvious disabilities tended to have a higher index that this was important, as well as female and racial ethnic minorities with disabilities as compared to male or white peers. So certain populations, this is a bigger deal, flexibility and work-life balance, perhaps for other things going on in their life, such as childcare, caretaker responsibilities. Self-identifying as a person with a disability, as I mentioned, is important to many of our employers. And so we did ask questions about this as well. 4 out of 5 of our respondents mentioned that they have always or sometimes been asked to complete a self-identification in their recent job application. So that's interesting. It's also interesting that about not quite 1 in 5, 16% have not been asked to fill out the form. And by the form, we talk about more often we're meaning the form that is used by federal contractors. There is a prescribed form for use for self-identification from the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs. Additionally, 54% of our respondents always identify as a person with a disability. That's what they reported to us. 42% said they sometimes self-identify. Again, this often has something to do with the visibility of the disability, particularly in this part of the application process. Another question we asked was, what are the elements on a website that would increase the likelihood that you would self-identify as a person with a disability? And what our respondents told us is having flexible work arrangements. So they already know, 2 out of 5 said this, that there is some kind of receptivity to an accommodation that might include a flexibility in how you want to approach the job, either in terms of hours or location. Having a diversity and inclusion statement or information that includes disability, 36%. Work-life balance programs, 32%. Disability-focused hiring programs, 31%. So all things that heighten the likelihood that people will self-identify in this process. Of course, every study has limitations, and ours does as well. We know that the sample we had was very much targeted to organizations recruiting people with disabilities. So we had a higher likelihood, which was great for us, but they were job seekers with disabilities, higher representation among the groups we recruited from. They had a pretty high level of educational attainment, higher than the general population with disabilities, and the employment rates that are found in the working age population of people with disabilities more broadly. And it wasn't possible, the way we constructed the survey, for job seekers to actually view career pages while taking the survey. So they were doing this from memory, from their recollection of what they had experienced in their job search process within the last 2 years. So a discussion on this, and then we're going to talk about what the implications are for good practices. Our hope was that these findings would help employers. I'm hoping many of you represent organizations that may be thinking about how you broaden your recruitment efforts and heighten the likelihood that people with disabilities, as well as other historically marginalized populations, marginalized from the labor force, might be enticed to consider jobs and get the support they need to develop the capabilities for those jobs if they don't have them. But some of the findings that to help employers, we found we wanted to improve their approach to online outreach to job seekers with disabilities and get them to prioritize career page messaging to potential applicants with disabilities. We think it's really important that they signal their commitment to hiring employees with disabilities. And we believe that these good practices will potentially increase a willingness on the part of these applicants with disabilities to self-identify during the recruitment and application process, which we know to many employers will be very helpful because they have they have a responsibility, a requirement to be able to report on counting how many people are applying with disabilities to their jobs and making it through the interview, screening, and hiring processes. Flexibility and work-life balance, obviously, we found out may appeal to job seekers more generally, not just people with disabilities. By proactively offering such benefits, job seekers with disabilities may be less likely to need an accommodation to be able to do their job. So they won't have to ask for it. It will just be a part of what's afforded all employees, which many people tell us is very desirable, and they're more likely to self-identify if they know that it's a generally approved process for people when they ask. These types of programs signal an inclusive workplace for mothers, caregivers, people with disabilities, and others. So it's nice to have it as a generalized practice from what our respondents told us. We know that tailoring career pages with some of this information, employers can potentially increase interest among job seekers with disabilities, but also those from other multiply marginalized identities. So people with disabilities who are ethnic racial minorities, and women and other marginalized populations they similarly find these kinds of signals as attractive when they represent their interests. So in the next few minutes we have, I want to just talk about the implications for effective practices with a focus on what workplace agents, supervisors, and employers in general can do to make career pages more attractive to applicants with disabilities. So we have a checklist on our website. You're going to get at the end of this a link to the website where it has these resources. The checklist includes these kinds of things: evidence of top leadership commitment to disability inclusion, credible messages via authentic media, such as testimonials from individuals with disabilities or videos of people with disabilities in that workplace, just as 2 examples. Accommodations and supports for individuals either in the recruitment process or once they're in the workplace, having been hired, is important. Disability hiring priorities are visible. Flexibility in work options are highlighted, and it spotlights partnerships with community-based organizations that source qualified candidates with disabilities. Accessibility of the career portal and availability of disability-related content is really important. Accessibility should just be a baseline. We should all be designing our websites from the get-go with the criteria from the accessibility guidelines, the WCAG. They're out there for us. They're publicly available. And so using this as the guide as you design your web pages will save a lot of heartache in trying to redo it later on. So doing it from the front end is really important. Making information about requesting accommodations obvious and easy to access, including visual representation of disability in your content online, using diversity and inclusion statements that go beyond the boilerplate equal opportunity language, make it very obvious that disability is a part of that. Provide options for multiple modes of communicating with recruiters. So instant chat and email, make it easy for people to access you, ask questions about accommodations, and find out more about any affirmative hiring initiatives that you might have that they might want to avail themselves of in this process of applying. Appeal to job seekers with disabilities. What we were told, spotlight messaging to veterans and people with disabilities on the career pages helps. Highlighting organization characteristics like disability-related corporate social responsibility initiatives, including explicit statements about the value of inclusion and diversity, promoting flexible workplace options, providing closed captioning and audio description for all recruiting videos and media content. We know that that's very important. And that is a part as well of an accessible website. So, and avoid things that unintentionally screen out qualified candidates. So what we've learned from all that research that we did is that think about your job descriptions. Are there inflexible standards that are really not necessary, that are screening people out? It could be a driver's license. It could be some task that you really is a marginal task and you could take out. I think making it evident, maybe just using the high level absolute required standards or criteria in your jobs to not unnecessarily let people screen themselves out because they feel they don't have all of those different either skill sets or credentials. Offering job trials or probationary periods to assess job fit rather than just going through a traditional job recruitment process or screening process. Considering people with employment gaps in their resumes and the opportunity to find out what that gap might be, or overlooking those gaps and just taking people where they are. Ensuring that modes of communication meet the needs of applicants with disabilities, like having video relay services, electronic communication that is accessible to screen readers. And we talked a little bit about that. Checklist for HR professionals as we close. Incorporate diversity hiring initiatives into social media-based recruitment strategies. So be sure that all of your social media recruitment makes in diversity initiatives evident, but particularly disability is what we're talking about today. Providing appropriate resources to bridge accessibility and outreach gaps. Frequently auditing your hiring practices for continuous improvement and inclusivity to all populations, including those with disabilities and who are neurodiverse. Recognizing the importance of early stage reactions to disability messaging on candidate choices like the application process, disclosure, and self-identification. Gathering feedback regularly from online employer review sites. Disability affinity group members, you could certainly use your ERG to help you with taking a look at your website. Do post-hire surveys to find out what candidates' experience was in that process so that you can tweak it, refine it, and make it even more accessible. And with that, I want to make sure I point out to you that with these, this PowerPoint, you will have access to these related employer assistance resource network resources, like there's information on this research on online recruitment of and outreach to people with disabilities, and encouraging applicants with disabilities with a focus on job descriptions and announcements, informational brochure, and inclusion messaging assessment checklist for career pages is brochure, informational brochure, a summary of the survey results I just shared with you, and also an informational brochure on inclusive branding and messaging, again, with a focus on people with disabilities. I also want to mention that there are a couple of slides with references as we stop and pause for questions. And Elizabeth's going to come back on and help me with navigating this part of the process.
Hello again. Thank you so much, Suzanne. What a wonderful presentation. So much information, so much practical information to bring and hopefully implement into workplaces right away after attending today's session. So with that, we'll just hop right into the first question we have here, and that's a little bit future thinking. So Suzanne, would you be able to share what you see as some of the future ways or what you're hoping for out of the future of online recruitment strategies? And are there particular trends or even technologies that people should be looking out for to adapt into their online recruitment strategies? With a particular focus here, I'm seeing of any discussion around AI, and with that burgeoning happening, is there anything that you can shed some light on to that as well?
There's certainly a great deal of conversation about AI and its potential, both to be a facilitator for individuals to access jobs, but also can be a barrier as well. And the barrier I mentioned already, and that is the AI search engines are designed by humans who have certain limitations and biases in how they're designing things. So being aware as an employer that that can be the case, that we may be inadvertently screening out people, and being very clear about what the criteria are that you're using in AI-driven algorithms for candidate selection for the next steps of the interview process is really important. And I would say for job candidates, with disabilities is AI can also be a facilitator. I know people with ADHD find using chat GPT very helpful in formulating messaging and making sure that any errors in their writing might be helped. So there's definitely both pros and cons for us to be vigilant about, and the technology continues to emerge. So this will be an ever-evolving vigilance about how we minimize barriers and maximize the potential and share it with people who can be advantaged in using AI-driven tools.
Yes, absolutely. It is quite the topic in a lot of different contexts right now. So I think it is important to bring both of those perspectives. And just a quick follow-up on that, you mentioned, there are some standards around website accessibility and things like that. But when dealing with those maybe screening tools or what we just discussed, the AIs around that might have algorithms in screening candidates, are there any particular standards or resources that employers could look to kind of help in going against perhaps some biases that are already embedded in those kinds of algorithms?
I will, again, I'll point, Elizabeth, and if you can put it in the chat, that would be great.
Yeah.
The Ask Earn website that is for the U.S. Department of Labor, Employer
Okay.
Assistance Resource Network on Disability Inclusion. It's www.askearn.org. And that website, if you search on AI, does have some information on AI. I also would point you toward the Partnership on Employment and Assistive Technology website, PEAT. That website has indeed is targeted toward technology and disability in the employment process, and also has many resources on the impact of AI with a focus on disability.
Well, that's fantastic. So I've just dropped those quick links back into the chat as well. So
Okay, good.
thank you so much for adding to the lexicon of dealing with, again, this very new and burgeoning conversation. So looking at some of the different kind of targets or evaluation measures, you mentioned yourself that there was a 7% requirement in certain positions that you were talking about. And we just have a question here around the effectiveness of that kind of target, like embedding, we're looking for a 10%, workforce of disability, like that kind of a target. Do you find that to be effective, or are there different evaluation measures that might be providing more more commitment to it, as opposed to maybe feeling like you're checking a box just because there's a number you're trying to attain?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And there certainly has been a great debate about it because many countries have had quotas for years
Right.
and penalties around not approximating those quotas with companies. The US still does not have a quota per se. We have an aspirational target in the federal government of 12%, in the among federal contractors of 7%. And here's what I would say about that is it's not a panacea by any means, but it is helpful because we do know to get something done, setting goals or targets is critically important. And these aspirational goals or quotas do put in the mind of the employer and also of the partners that they work with that there is a desire to have a proportion of people with disabilities in that workforce. So having goals really does make a difference. We found in our research that having a targeted goal of hiring people with disabilities, and it could be a percentage or a number of people, heightens the likelihood by 5 times that the employer will have affirmatively hired people with disabilities. So setting targets as a part of a strategic imperative, as a business would do with any other kinds of things, does embed it into the effort of the organization and heighten the likelihood that you'll be successful. So for that reason, I think targeted goals are very helpful. But indeed, you have to, and people discern the difference, you have to put behind that real action that demonstrates that you are not just checking a box, that you are indeed creating a culture that is inclusive where people can thrive. So it's important that the ethos behind that percentage or that goal is really sincere. People sense it in your messaging and in your actions.
Yeah, so there needs to be that, like you mentioned, that authenticity behind the goals. But that's a great statistic to know that it's actually that 5 times more effective to have a specific goal. That's kind of a new stat for me. So that's really exciting to hear, that it is in that way so helpful. But again, backing it up with the authenticity and ethos behind it. So kind of building on that, actually. So you did talk about how having some of these programs embedded around maybe work-life balance or things like that can be looked at as extra desirable, if you will, because it might actually reduce the need for accommodation. So just looking to have a bit of a discussion between the difference of accommodating versus being accessible already, and what maybe having that differentiator between needing accommodation versus already having accessibility at the table, and how that might be helpful for those that have disabilities in their job journey.
So you want me, you'd like me to comment on that?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yes, please.
yeah.
Just the discussion between accommodation and accessibility, and how that might be, how that might differentiate for people in their job seeking journey.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, accommodations has been identified with individuals and accessibility more generally creating a workplace, an environment that is accessible to people. We talk a lot about universal design for that reason, that we are creating workplaces that will be accessible to people with all kinds of potential limitations, our aging workforce, people with mobility impairments, whatever different kinds of health conditions that may have limitations. So it is indeed important to think about designing workplaces that have universal design. It not only will mean that you'll be able to retain an aging workforce, it means that people with disabilities won't have to feel like they're singling themselves out to ask for something they might need that is really a productivity enhancement. Too often we put the label of accommodation just on disability. We know, looking at our census data in the US, that 95% of accommodations, this is from self-report on census data, come from people without disabilities. Employers are making accommodations all the time. They don't think about it. They don't use necessarily that terminology. We do more so for people with disabilities, but the reality of it is, to retain our workforce, we make adjustments of all kinds, and people's time away from work and where they're working, in ergonomic changes that may not necessarily be directly with a health condition concern. And we too often think of it, when the request comes from a person with an obvious disability, that it's disability related. It's a minority of the requests that come to employers. So it's making sure that we make that evident and obvious, and encourage employers to think about these as productivity enhancements that benefit their whole workforce and have minimal costs. We know that 80% of accommodations cost under $500. That's a very little investment to keep somebody productive and in their workforce. It's far more expensive to have to go out and recruit a new person because you've lost someone who feels like they can't do their job because they can't get the accommodation that they need.
Well, I love that broadening of perspective of, because I do think there is a bit of a stigma, if I can say, around the word accommodation. And I just think that that's a wonderful way to take a step back and thinking about what adjustments are you making that probably would fall under accommodation, but we don't think of it that way, out of, again, just looking at, oh, it's fine to sign in at 10 a.m. instead on Wednesdays for, a particular scheduling conflict or something like that. So I love bringing that perspective. I am seeing that we're right at the end of time here, so I'll just end with a last question coming in here. So in adopting some of the practices you spoke on today, is there ever a concern about managing backlash from perceptions of unfairness? If so, do you have any recommendations on mitigating this?
That has been a question that has been, I think, been around forever as we looked at minority populations, that it's not just disability. And of course, I think workplaces do have to be mindful of that. The best way to mitigate it is to have a truly inclusive, generically inclusive workplace, where you have workplace practices that are transparent, that are evenly applied. Having a just workplace to begin with mitigates any concerns when we are many concerns when we are trying to affirmatively advantage a historically problematic in our approaches process for other people. So that's really the best advice I can give. It's really scrutinizing how you are treating people in general. A just workplace tends to broaden the perspective when you are trying to advantage people who have been historically disadvantaged.
Oh, thank you so much for that. And I'll just maybe close with this, Suzanne. If there would be one first step that you would ask people to take away from this in their efforts to be more inclusive in their recruitment, particularly in this online world we're living in, what would you recommend that our participants do today?
Well, I'm going to say, based on, you should start with a workplace inclusion inside your organization, but make that evident in how you display yourself as a company externally. That's really what we're talking about here today. And I'll just say, having internships is probably the best thing you can start with. We know that if companies have internships, they're 6 times more likely to have successfully recruited in the last year. Making that obvious, that's a statement about inclusion, and it's an action that will lead to positive outcomes. So that would be my first recommendation.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. I so appreciate your time today and sharing all of the wonderful research and findings that you've brought forward, as well as this great conversation to end with our audience today and getting those burning questions answered. So thank you so much for that. We have come to the end of our webinar today. So thank you again to everyone for being here and spending this hour with us. For those Work Wellness Institute members, a free certificate of attendance will automatically pop up in your inbox after today's presentation. And of course, if you have any questions as a member or non-member, please send an email right through to membership services@workwellnessinstitute.org. And to learn more about us or just be up to date on what's going on, you can always sign up for our newsletter, as well as, again, going to our website and clicking the courses and resources sections on there to just see all of the resources and upcoming programming that we have. And speaking of upcoming programming, we do have another webinar at the very end of the month on January 31st on returning to work in police services with Dr. Dwayne Van Eerd. So hopefully we will see you there as well. Once again, thank you so much to our audience for tuning in and spending this hour with us, as well as Suzanne for being here and bringing forth your very important expertise in the space of disability and inclusion. Thank you again, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.
Continue to learn and connect with the Work Wellness Institute and see how we're transforming research into workplace performance and health at www.workwellnessinstitute.org.